In Syria, the ghost of Rousseau is exorcised by the ghost of Guzzo. This in the year of Kamala Harris on Whispers of a Dark Future.
You think you just fell out of a coconut tree?
So today, we're going to talk about the current situation in Syria, particularly its interim new president and the SDF forces and the conflict going on between them. And what do we want to say? And what's our initial thoughts about the new president of Syria?
Well, how would you taxonomize him ideologically? Let's start with the.
Well, what's fascinating about the HTS and it's sweeping the country and the new interim president, Al-Shara, hopefully I'm not mispronouncing this, is he is profoundly not only centrist liberal, but he's profoundly a moderate left technocrat. Well, I should probably just say moderate technocrat. I guess we don't really know specific policies yet, whether or not he's really, liberal conservative or whatever. Point is, his goal right now is to build a modern liberal democracy with all the bells and whistles of faceless institutions, news agencies that can manufacture consent, and some epic cartelized multi-party democracy. And as he attempts to achieve this, the world around him, particularly in the liberal world, sees tremendous backsliding, right? And so, in Being's opinion, this might well be the last liberal democracy in the sense that it's the last time we will see a centrist liberal revolution in a sea of illiberalizing democracies. And the most unfortunate thing is this new president has to work with Donald Trump, which has to be the very odd alliance of these forces. So that's my opinion on the new government.
Yeah, you got to imagine that the fact that Trump won the election was a big blow for the HTS, because their whole project is, okay, we're going to cuddle up to the West by signaling our support for, liberal democracy. But, now that Trump's in power in the United States, I guess still the premier Western state, Donald Trump is doing everything he can to eliminate liberal democracy. And so it's, I think, put the HTS in a very awkward and precarious position. I think something further that's put the HTS in an awkward position is the fact that the leader of the HTS, something that's been very influential on his political career is the Palestinian struggle against Israel. And, recently when Israel decided to seize a bunch of land from Syria, took the opportunity after the fall of the Bashar al-Assad regime, because he's doing this whole cuddle up to the West thing, he had to sort of, despite his history, he had to say, no, it's okay, we don't want any conflict with Israel. So, those are two things that I think are extremely problematic for the new project. The fact that it has to work with Donald Trump and the fact that it has to sort of temper any sort of action or rhetoric against Israel.
Right. And I think what's interesting is the bigger backdrop of Syria, like particularly the Ba'athist government. Assad's government was the last of the so-called Arab socialists, when really Being would argue they were Jacobins. Their whole argument was to build a sort of classless, egalitarian national republic for the Arab people, in which, class grievances and struggles were subsumed by national equalities and all that. And it was up to an educated elite to teach the people how to self-rule. And so this elite would argue, for this period of time, I will rule as a dictator, but at some nebulous time, I will decide to let go of it all. And, not Nasser, Gaddafi, Saddam, all these people wiped out one by one. What happens after the Nasser regime collapses? It decays into a liberal autocracy. Centrist liberalism comes in, sweeps out this Robespierrean ghost and implants epic liberal actually it doesn't put in epic liberal democracy, it puts in liberal autocracy, interestingly enough. The U.S. invades Iraq, takes down the Saddam regime, and plants a semi-functioning liberal democracy there that's still dealing with a lot of problems. And then, of course, with Gaddafi, after just obliterating his forces, Libya is just now a failed state. still engaged in a brutal civil war. And then, of course, so lastly, we had Assad, and it was up to Assad, the last of these Arab Jacobins, if you will, to finally provide and teach the people the virtues of self-governing republican rule by imprisoning them, brutalizing them, and holding on to as much power as possible in a dying regime. And of course, in the end, he is swept away by this centrist liberal force. And not only is this the last liberal democracy, being there says Assad's fall is the last Jacobin regime. And if the SDF falls, that'll be the last, well, not the last, but one of the last big radical Republican revolution. Because as being in Viper, as we've argued, Rojava isn't libertarian socialist for us. It's a form of radical liberalism, part of the oldest species of radical liberalism, radical republicanism, the Rousseauian dream of sovereign assemblies and a majoritarian republic of virtue, and they too, if they're swept away, then it's essentially over for 21st century radical liberalism, except maybe the left populists are still kicking here and there. Is there anything you want to add to what I'm saying?
Yeah, I mean, one thing I think should be pointed out is that there's a sort of phenomena among sort of non-state national liberation and Marxist-Leninist or communist political organizations that, wage a military struggle and then come to power, where they sort of substitute the agency of the masses that they're supposed to be liberating with their own political military struggle for, power and money, right? And that's, quite scandalous, right? In their case, because, national liberation is supposed to give the people self-determination. The whole point of communism is to liberate people from capitalist imperialism. And so it becomes very scandalous when then there's this new coercive power that ends up subjugating the people for its own interests, claiming to be the expression of the interests of the people, right? It's a very scandalous situation. In this case, you have essentially the same thing, right? In the sense that there's a new power, it's subordinating the people while claiming to be liberating them. But that's sort of unlike the Marxist-Leninists or the national liberation fighters. This new power can sort of say that openly, because the whole point is, okay, we're doing technocratic liberalism, right? So it's only natural. The HTS leader in an interview openly sort of says, and nobody questions it, we appointed the new president when we came to power. We didn't democratically elect the president. We appointed the president. The reason that that's not scandalous is because the technocratic liberal assumption is that, okay, you establish a new state, and then, you then have to use mediatory methods to ensure a stable transition from dictatorship to democracy. And so, you'll have to have, sort of appointed liberal head of state before there can be democratic elections, right? So, the sort of unsettling thing is that in the case of liberal democracy, this substitution of the power of the state and the rulers for the agency of the masses isn't even scandalous in the way that it's scandalous in the communist and national liberation cases. It's, it's what you're supposed to do. And I think further, there's real questions about the ability of the HTS to maintain the sort of liberal project. The HTS leader is a former, the HTS basically is a breakaway from jihadism, right? And the HTS leader himself sort of downplays his time as a jihadist. He basically says like, oh, I was, fighting against American imperialism in the Middle East. And then, suddenly, behind my back, all these different groups came together and formed Al-Qaeda. And so, he downplays his time as a jihadist. He also needs to maintain this, okay, we respect minorities. We don't do brutal reprisals against our enemies. But when the HTS took over, became the de facto governing power of a particular region in Syria, right, during the civil war, it was actually fairly beneficent to minorities. So they, kept that promise. They, were consistent on that in practice. But they also, arbitrarily detained people, tortured people. So it's not like they were tolerant of dissent. And so, the HTS has a background in illiberal movements. It is conditioned to the use of illiberal policies to some extent. And so then when there's this further question of now the HTS has to consolidate itself as the leadership of the nations of, the Syrian nation state after a civil war, after the fall of a regime, in the wake of the fact that there are still, the Syrian democratic forces that, have their own agenda. How long can, and of course, as you said, in a wider world of liberal democratic backsliding, how long can the charade go on? But yeah.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because there was a Frenchman named Guizot in the mid-19th century in France. Okay, he stood between two forces in French politics. It was the radical liberals, the radical Republicans, the Jacobins, the Bonapartists, who wanted essentially governments of the general will. This, big bombastic republicanism, egalitarianism. They're subordinating the masses to the silent higher will of the general will. The masses silence to the majority. Be it the sovereign assembly, educated elite, or the republic as incarnate by the House of Bonaparte. And then on the other side of Guizot stood, the legitimists, the restorationists, people who wanted this illiberal conservative restoration of absolute kinship, theocracy, absolute monarchy. And Guizot stood in the middle, and he created the foundations for politics to be anti-Rousseauian and to propose that liberalism is not about the masses. It's not about the general will. It's about bureaucracy. It's about going to the bank and taking out a loan. It's not about these silly things like freedom. It's about, owning a small business. None of this economic democracy nonsense, And what's happening in the Middle East, in Syria, is, the ghost of these forces, these historical forces, has returned. And of course, the SDF is in a precarious, ambiguous position of wanting, a place in a new Syria to allow their democratic nation, their autonomous region, to be part of a new Syrian constitution. And of course, the HTS leader seems ambiguous to this proposition, probably is presumably antagonistic because he has to, make a deal of sorts with his neighbors, one of which is an illiberal conservative force, the Turkish government, which is a right populist force, and then you've got, another one, Syria, Trump, right? And it's fascinating because you have essentially, the bastions of liberal democracy here in Syria having to bow themselves to these ancient forces that tried to, centuries ago, murder all the liberals and reinstitute, traditional hierarchies and ways of life and some such. But yeah, I think we should really explain our opinion that Rojava is not this libertarian socialist project, but rather this radical liberal project and all this, because I think some listeners are going to be confused. They're going to be like, Rojava, my autonomous administration of North and East Syria, the great anarchist project. Why, Piper, is it not a great anarchist project?
Well, I mean, there's, a lot of reasons why it isn't an anarchist project. Perhaps the first one is that the, supposed inspiration, supposed source of the inspiration of this project by anarchist politics is Murray Bookchin. And Murray Bookchin, he was in some sense a part of the anarchist movement for a long time. He thought of himself as an anarchist, and he tried to persuade anarchists to get on board with his ideas. But he ultimately left the anarchist movement because really he wasn't an anarchist. Yes, he believed in a non-hierarchical alternative to capitalism. Yes, he invoked anarchist communism when talking about his vision of a classless, horizontally organized society without the market. Yes, he, wrote about, the sort of anarchism as a mass movement, in a complementary way, but he wasn't really an anarchist because he didn't believe in the sort of foundational principle of anarchist political philosophy. The foundational principle of anarchist political philosophy is that you know free association is superior to domination, right? And so you immediately replace relationships of domination with relationships of free association, and for Bookchin that was far too individualist. Bookchin thought that in a genuinely egalitarian society there had to be social and political mechanisms to chain the conduct of individuals to the sort of interests of the larger society, right? Liberals call that the social contract, right? And anarchists object to the social contract on the basis that it can only be enforced by a sort of hierarchical centralized authority, right? And thus, is incompatible with the free association of human beings, right? And anarchists themselves voiced this issue to Bookchin, and ultimately that led to him and his supporters breaking off from the anarchist movement, realizing that they didn't have a place in it, and trying to, reconstruct their ideology as what they called communalism. And so, and further to boot, this sort of, radical liberalism on the part of Bookchin sort of influenced, a very sort of non-anarchist approach to social change. Bookchin, the whole reason that Bookchin, became an anarchist and rejected Marxism is because he thought that the working class had been subsumed into the structures of capitalist society after the First World War. And so it could not be a revolutionary subject for social change anymore. And so he thought, mistakenly, that anarchism was a sort of alternative for social change based on, the struggle of the citizen for freedom and equality rather than the struggle of the working class against capitalism. When in fact, the entire anarchist tradition is suffused with the idea that the working class is the subject of revolutionary change, right? And he knew this to some extent because this is why he engaged in all kinds of polemic against anarcho-syndicalism, the sort of anarchist political strategy based on, the working class organizing libertarian labor unions to carry out the class struggle against capitalist society and the state. So, the supposed anarchist inspiration was actually, in fact, a radical liberal inspiration going under the name of anarchism. And as such, Öcalan's vision, Öcalan is the leader of the PKK and the ideologist of the PKK and the PYD, the sort of, and the PYD is the sort of important, very important governing organization within Rojava. That ideology is, accordingly, a version of radical liberalism. The idea is you have, a radically decentralized, governance structure that enables horizontal civilian participation, but is also binded together by a central authority. These are, central authority is, how Öcalan puts it, right? It's also binded together by a central authority to make sure that the conduct of the individuals is tied to the interests of the whole society. And And, this is not a vision that is, unlike, it's actually sort of a less radical liberalism than Bookchin's radical liberalism. Bookchin's radical liberalism was inconsistent with capitalism and class society and nationalism. Öcalan's is not inconsistent with those things. Öcalan imagines that, instead of abolishing the nation, what his project does is it democratizes the nation into a set of confederal interstate structures, right? So it allows for democratic harmony among national groups rather than the abolition of the nation. And Öcalan's preferred economic or preferred political economy is the political economy of social democratic welfare states. So, and, as such, the Rojava is governed by, yes, there are the, assemblies and councils, but they're in a sort of, they're subordinated to a larger sort of proto-state structure that has, elections and electoral parties, and with a constitution that allows private property. So, there's really nothing anarchist about any of this. It's, sort of, if anything, it's the disillusion of anarchism into radical liberalism.
Well, yeah. Well, people say, look, the hierarchies are hierarching, and Bookchin didn't want those hierarchying anymore. He wanted the hierarchical, non-hierarchies hierarchies. But listen, if you read Free Cities, Bookchin says, a municipality's constitution and laws should define the duties as well as the rights of the citizen. Right? Bookchin's society, the assemblies at the heart of this, are a recreation of what? Popular sovereignty. Right? A constitution wrapped around the general will of the people, as exemplified through an assembly, is the recreation of the classic liberal concept of popular sovereignty. Yes, technically, nations are not mentioned, but it's still not great either. Because as anarchists, we don't care about sovereignty. We say hooey to your sovereignty, either divine or popular. We don't care about constitutional orders and regulatory laws. We care about freedom, the person as unsubtracted by these contracts, the person fully realized as society and individual are fully integrated in networks upon networks of associated and disassociating complexities. Not bogged down into these layers of bureaucracies where you and I every Sunday morning, every few hours, you gotta go run to the assembly. Oh no, we ran out of toilet paper. We gotta go back to the assembly. We gotta institute a law on who's gonna get the toilet paper. Okay, maybe we start organizing the toilet paper security or something. We start housing all of our resources in a giant building or something, and then we have the assemblies decide who gets to rent this or that, and Bookchin says, oh, the sovereign enterprise's production should be managed by popular sovereignty. Amazing. You know who else says popular sovereignty should manage production? Most liberals, particularly radical liberals. It's funny, economic democracy is not foreign to liberalism. It was actually argued time and time again by liberals that economic democracy was important for representing the social contract in economic.
We won't have socialism if we democratize the enterprise.
Exactly. Anyways, I know the hierarchies are hierarchying, but listen, the point of anarchism was to not get stuck in the rigid polities of all the assembly and democracy. Again, it was something far, far more extreme. To be unbound by territorial appendages, the tentacles of soil and blood, getting Bookchin, in effect, advocates for a patchwork of many municipal states that each person is forced to be inside of, to have to constantly in and out of assemblies. This litany, in fact, I would go as far as argue that Bookchin is not really arguing against interstate, really. In fact, all of production has to be parcelized between each individual tiny municipality and its assembly. We're just going to get an interstate again, And the people as abstracted by the assembly managing production doesn't really sound like the people are managing production. It sounds like the this abstraction is managing production, not the people. There is no free production here. You know, Bookchin, when he says this, the free citizens, this is about the free citizens, the citizen. The citizen is a territorial concept, bound to contracts and laws and states, no matter how tiny. Anarchists, we say, who cares about your citizen? It's poo-poo. No citizens. There will be no citizens in anarchism. And if anybody tries to sell you citizens, okay, they have a tiny pocket-sized copy of the social contract by Rousseau. It's what they have in their back pocket. All right, Piper, what would you say to this?
What I say to what?
The hierarchies that are hierarchically hierarching.
I think the existence of Anarch on YouTube is a illegitimate hierarchy.
That is hot drama. Hot, bad drama. It's going to hurt the non-hierarchical movement. You can't be just Anarch sucks. He's the terrible representation of anarchism. He made a whole video saying how much he loves Roosevelt checks and balances, how much he loves his constitutional assemblies, how much he thinks the separation of powers is great. You know, we can't mock him for essentially arguing for Madisonian anarchism. We can't do that. We have to blind.
Yeah, I love anarcho-liberalism.
Well, we have to look. All I'm saying is, if you love checks and balances, if you love separation of powers, and look, I get it. I'm not calling Rojava a Madisonian democracy. I think it's more. I think it's an attempt. You know, Rojava is the Oshala and all that. I think it's a radical republic. But listen, if you love, you know who else has epic checks and balances, epic separation of powers? America. Well, not anymore. But you know what I'm saying.
Well, it for now it has those things.
And you know, we wrote an essay. There's 2 essays we'll recommend. One co-written by us. Democratic Confederalism is not libertarian socialism, linked below. And then, of course, Mick Politics, Moderate Technocracy with Fries, linked below. The situation being wants to say and state, Rojavan forces, Kurdish forces being brutalized is terrible, and being advocates for the unconditional, complete autonomy and liberation of every single Kurd in free association with all the rest of humanity, unbound by these laws and constitutions and citizenships.
Right.
All right. Do we want to say anything more about the HTS leader and how epic nation building he's doing right now?
I mean, I don't know. I'm not even sure he's doing much. You know. I mean, I guess we'll have to see where it goes. I sort of have from the beginning been thinking that, you know, the Civil War is not actually going to end, and it's just going to continue. So, you know, there's, you know, fighting is going to resume at some point. I could be wrong, but that's what I sort of expect.
Well, hopefully, there's not any more bloodshed. Unfortunately, with the way things are going, it looks like there's going to be more and more bloodshed. It looks like this historical episode isn't quite done. But as of right now, we have a 21st century example of an epic centrist liberal, moderate technocracy, epic revolution that I'm sure will last many years, probably not very long, who knows. And while as much as liberals can say, look, we got Syria. Yes, well, you're losing the United States. You're losing India. You're losing Hungary.
Losing everywhere else.
You're losing everywhere else. Liberalism is over. And what we need now is not constitutions, but free association, as I've been harping on the whole time. That's all I have to say about this subject. Any closing thoughts?
The closing thoughts are check out our Patreon, link it below.
All right. Our closing words of the week, of the bye week, are Icicle, Mad World for the Wii, and Steve on a Motorcycle. Thank you, and this has been Whispers of a Dark Future.
Here's the